Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the economy in Cuba. Now, if you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll know that we've been talking about Cuba for the last 3 years, and there have been some serious problems. But over the past few months, those problems have accelerated. And recently, we have seen nationwide blackouts. And those blackouts are partly as a result of the fact that the electricity generation infrastructure in Cuba is now very old and decrepit. Many of those plants were built around 50 years ago, and they had an expected life of around 25 to 30 years. And unfortunately, they haven't been well maintained. So we're starting to see failure of some of that infrastructure. But we're also seeing a problem with regards to Cuba not receiving as much crude oil as it did historically. It was recently reported that in the period between January and November, the imports from Venezuela, which is a fellow communist country, fell by more than 44%. And the problem that Cuba has is that it simply doesn't have enough money to be able to buy that replacement oil in the international markets. Cuba is currently reliant upon friendly gestures from countries like Venezuela, Russia and Mexico, whereby they're given large amounts of oil that they can have on credit or basically just given it for free. And on top of the recent problems that have been reported with regards to electricity, it's now been reported that Cuba is running short at the fuel pumps. And fuel shortages are going to make the situation in Cuba worse because the people of Cuba rely upon fuel in order to get around the country. The public transportation system is based on buses or taxis. So if they don't have fuel, obviously they can't run. And this is now causing a major problem for one of Cuba's biggest industries, tourism. As you're probably aware, Cuba is located in the Caribbean Sea and therefore has a really attractive climate. It's nice and warm and attracts in lots of tourists. This chart shows the annual total of international visitors to Cuba between 2000 and 2023. And what this chart shows is that in the 18 years between 2000 and 2018, there was a gradual increase in total visitor numbers from around 1.8 million to more than 4.7 million. However, unfortunately for Cuba, the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected international travel all around the globe, had a devastating impact on the tourist industry. And in 2021, the total number of international visitors had fallen to less than 500,000. That figure increased to around 1.5 million in 2022, and in 2023, there were around 2.5 million international visitors, which was a similar level that had been achieved in 2010. So basically the COVID-19 pandemic has put the tourism industry in Cuba back by around 13 years. Now, as I said at the start of today's video, tourism is really important to the Cuban economy. In 2023, it was estimated to contribute around 8% of total GDP, and in 2024, it was forecast that that figure would increase to closer to 9%. However, the recent problems have damaged the tourism industry in Cuba. This table shows the monthly breakdown of the total number of tourists arriving in Cuba in 2024 and 2023 in the period through to October, which is the latest data that's been made available. And what you can see here is that in the first 3 months of 2024, the total number of tourists increased. In January, there was a 4.3% increase. In February, the total numbers were up by just under 12%, and in March, they were up by 6.7%. However, in the 7 months between April and October, the total number of tourists arriving reduced. In April and May, tourist numbers were down by 7% and 6%. However, the fall increased to almost 13% in June, almost 20% in July and August. The fall increased to almost 25% in September and just under 21% in October. And if we look at the breakdown of where those tourists are coming from, you can see that the country that sends the most tourists by far is Canada, representing over 39% of all tourists. The second largest percentage come from Russia, representing 8.5%, followed by the USA, Spain, Germany, Mexico and France. So as you've just seen, Cuba is dependent upon Canadian tourists, and there is now a major problem from Cuba's point of view, because as a result of the problems with regards to the infrastructure and electricity in Cuba, the Canadian government have now changed its advice on travel to Cuba and told all Canadian citizens that they need to exercise a high degree of caution when travelling on holiday to Cuba. And to make matters worse, one of Canada's prominent travel agents that promotes holidays to Cuba recently removed 26 Cuban hotels from its list and is now promoting alternative destinations to tourists such as the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, Honduras, and Colombia. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I know a lot of you are really interested in what's going on in Cuba, and it's really difficult to be able to find any information. So I'm constantly looking around for information to share with you, to pull together as much data as I can to keep you posted on what's happening. Now, clearly, the situation hasn't been improved in terms of the infrastructure because Cuba doesn't have hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to repair all of its electricity generation. It's struggling in terms of the sanctions that have been applied by the USA. The Cuban authorities are claiming that they can't actually source the parts that they need to repair their power stations because many of them are coming from the USA and therefore are embargoed. But also the Cuban authorities don't have the money to be able to pay for all of that repair. And they're saying that the reason for that is because of the sanctions that have been put in place by the USA. But whatever the situation is, they're not going to be able to fix the problems. So we're still seeing issues with regards to electricity generation. And that, of course, has huge implications for industry in Cuba because if you don't have power, you can't produce all of the things that you need to. Therefore, you're not going to be able to sell as many things. And so your income will be down. Therefore, you might not be able to hire as many people. And this becomes a really vicious circle. But also Cuba has suffered over the past few months as a result of two major hurricanes that hit the island, Oscar and Rafael. And also the second largest city, Santiago, was hit by an earthquake. So it is the classic situation of when it rains, it pours from Cuba's point of view. And tourism has been one of the strongest parts of the Cuban economy historically. Now, we saw from the graph earlier that the COVID-19 pandemic had a devastating impact on that level of tourism. It dropped from almost 5 million visitors per year to around 500,000. And of course, the infrastructure that was in place to service all of those tourists was still there. So we still had all of the hotels and all of the people. So that meant lots of people were put out of work and the repair and maintenance of those hotels wasn't kept up. So we have seen a deterioration in the quality of some of the accommodation. But what we've seen over the past few months is that the electricity blackouts have been having a further negative impact on tourism on the island. And the recent fuel shortages have also made things worse because everybody relies on taxis, those old American cars from the 1950s that are still being used on the roads in Havana that everybody loves to see. They haven't been actually able to get enough fuel to move all the tourists around. And what we've now seen is that the largest destination for tourism for Cuba, Canada, has issued a warning. The Canadian authorities have now said that anyone thinking of going on holiday to Cuba needs to exercise extreme caution. And of course, that's going to put a lot of people off. If your government is saying be careful of thinking about going to Cuba, you might just think of going somewhere else. And one of the biggest travel agents that's been promoting Cuban travel is now saying, why don't you think about going to other places that are also very similar to Cuba? So this is going to have a negative impact on the future trade for Cuba. And the next 6 months are the busiest period. The winter period is when a lot of Canadians actually go down to Cuba because they want to get away from all of the snow and the cold weather in Canada and they want to go and have a bit of winter sun. Now that is unlikely to happen this year, and so we could see another vicious circle forming here because if those hotels and the taxi drivers and all of the people who are dependent on tourist trade don't get the business, then they're going to struggle to be able to maintain their own infrastructure, and so we'll see a continued deterioration in quality. And what we've seen over the past few years is that the biggest increase in tourism is coming from Russia. And obviously that has its own issues, which I won't go into in this video. So the overall summary of today's video is that the problems that we've seen in Cuba over the past few years are continuing. They're actually getting worse because Cuba is struggling to be able to source enough fuel to be able to keep the electricity on and also fuel to keep the pumps full. So people are now struggling to be able to fill their vehicles. Those problems have been accentuated over the past couple of months by hurricanes and earthquakes. And we have now heard that the largest destination for tourists, Canada, has issued a warning to all of its people saying, be careful, think twice about going on holiday to Cuba. And one of the biggest travel agents has cut 26 hotels in Cuba from its list and is now promoting alternative destinations. And that is going to have a further detrimental impact on the Cuban economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.